Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, we are here with Carleton University's Dr. Jennifer Robson, and we in Ottawa have had this weird little psychodrama playing out over the last week and a bit, where the mayor is claiming that the federal government owes them millions and millions of dollars in payments in lieu of taxes. The federal government has basically told him to go pound sand. Jennifer has explained some of this over Twitter about what this all means, and I figured we'd have a quick conversation about this. Jennifer,
Hey, thanks for having me back.
always a pleasure.
Um, I love that expression, go pound sand. Yeah, that's kind of what they did tell him to do, didn't they? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think importantly too, because I think there would be contagion if they did accede to his demands.
So, I mean, like, okay, so he issued this like 5 point statement of
Right.
demands where some of it is aimed at the feds and some of it is aimed at the province. And if I were to sum up, it's sort of like for your Game of Thrones fans out there, it's sort of like Jon Snow saying it's not fair. Um, you know, it's sort of it's a bit of a mishmash, right? Like, so
Right.
he wants more money for public transit in the city of Ottawa. He's a little ambiguous as to whether he expects that to come from the province or the feds. He is also complaining that when the city does cost shared agreements, that they are left having to pay more than a third. More on that in a minute. And then, yes, there's this whole issue of payments in lieu of taxes, which is maybe the thing that you wanted to focus on. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's I think the first part, because that's something I don't think a lot of people understand what he was referring to there.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go public admin 101 on this one. So remember the authority to collect taxes is an authority of the crown, right? And in Canada, as a federation, we have distributed that crown authority across three different orders of government: federal, provincial, and then municipal. A long time ago, believe it or not, municipal governments actually charged their own income taxes and like death duties and all this sort of stuff. But now their main sort of form of taxation, in terms of direct taxation, is really property taxes. But the crown doesn't pay itself
Right.
taxes, right? Like that's,
Yes.
yeah, you don't rob Peter to pay Peter. You don't do that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so basic principle there. So instead, in order to recognize the exemption from taxation, but at the same time to recognize, look, there are municipal services that you are making use of in terms of water, sewer, roads, garbage collection, all these sorts of things that are really important and that get funded out of those general revenues. The federal government has, for decades, had a program called Payment in Lieu of Taxes, where they just transfer an amount of money that is based on whatever the local tax rate is, applied to the valuation of the property that they own.
Right.
And so the mayor is complaining that the federal government has unilaterally decided what its own properties are worth, and is therefore undervaluing them and underpaying their taxes, to the tune of his claim. It's a bit of a movable feast, even when you go and read, even when you go and read his press release on this. It's either 100 million over 8 years or 100 million over the last five. Anyway, in his list of demands, he wants compensation for underpayment to the tune of 100 million over five. I can't figure out where he got his number from. I genuinely can't.
Right. Right. And you had done a comparison in terms of certain years and what the payments were.
Yeah, yeah, okay. And so look, it is true that okay, sorry, got to back this up a little bit. The
Okay.
bulk the bulk of these payments in lieu of municipal taxes for the federal government are handled by Public Services and Procurement Canada, which
Right.
is sort of like the landlord property manager.
Yeah.
Think of it that way. And also the government body that makes buying anything incredibly complicated.
Right.
Anyway, yeah. So they handle the bulk of it. There are going to be a couple of Crown Corps, and thinking specifically of obviously here in Ottawa, the National Capital Commission, CMHC, Canada Post. All of those organizations have to pay their own property or payments in lieu of property taxes separately. So those are not kind of rolled up with the numbers I'm about to give you. And then on top of that, don't forget Ottawa also has all these embassies as well.
Right.
And we also have a program for payments in lieu of taxes for embassies that are quite clearly official embassies belonging to a foreign sovereign government.
Right.
Anyway, so all that to say, the numbers that I'm giving you are really kind of more for like, think about it as like more the core public service.
So most
And
government office buildings and
vast majority, right? Like the vast majority of the properties and the buildings and so forth. And so there we're talking about over a 10-year period, the first 5 years, the average was 130 million transferred from the federal government to the city of Ottawa. In the most recent 5 years, it was 120 million a year on average. Now, the numbers kind of have on average been going down over the last decade. They pop back up again from time to time. And largely that has to do with the fact that the federal government for a long time now has been getting out of the business of owning its own office buildings. So they've been doing an awful lot of things like they sell off the property and then they lease it back. Now, if you're a
I
renter,
seem to recall that was a big thing during the Harper era when they were
absolutely.
their cost reduction strategy.
Absolutely. And don't forget, even now, that's probably been accelerated with a move to more flexible workspaces where you don't necessarily need an office for everyone, a lot of hot desking and a lot of hybrid sort of work arrangements, people
Yeah.
commuting a couple of days a week, not every day. And also an initiative to repurpose federal lands for housing,
Right.
So that's, there kind of maybe some different motivations. It's not purely cost saving exercises now. It's trying to rationalize the actual asset holdings and look at like value for money. Does it make sense to own this? Does it make sense to lease it back? Does it make sense to sell it off and turn it into housing?
Yeah.
All this to say, if you're a renter, you don't pay property taxes to the city, right?
No,
Like
the landlord
the
does.
owner, the landlord does. And then
Yeah.
your rent reflects part of the landlord's costs for what they have to pay forward for the property tax. So, the mayor's statement also does talk about wanting some guarantee of stability in these payments in lieu of taxes, recognizing that the federal government has a commitment to reduce their basically their office footprint by 50%.
Yeah.
And so the city is pretty freaked out, I'm sure, about
Yes.
wow, that was a sweet deal. We had this guaranteed revenue stream. But again, like think about this. Those properties will be sold to someone. Those landlords will in turn then become responsible for the payment of property taxes.
And
So again, I really can't make
taxes.
sense.
So it should come out
Yeah,
in the wash.
it should. And like, look, municipalities across Ontario are facing a challenge because we know that real property values have increased significantly. But property valuations, so the cities don't determine what your property value is.
Right.
There's a provincial body called MPAC, Municipal Property Assessment Corporation, that takes care of that. And we are so overdue for a reevaluation. Property taxes are being levied on 2016 values.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is an issue there. Now, all of this to say, look, if you're a private owner, if you're a landlord, right, and you don't like what MPAC says about the value of your property, you can appeal, right? And some people do, and that works out that way. Likewise, cities who dispute what the feds are paying them in these payments in lieu of property taxes
Right.
can also appeal. And it's not clear, like the mayor hasn't clarified, has the
Done
city
that.
actually pursued that? Have they exhausted that avenue already? Yeah.
All
Again,
right.
I mean, if you were going to go and appeal this, if fundamentally your complaint is you keep selling off your properties and I don't like that,
Yeah.
that's probably not a winning case, right? Like
No.
you'd have to
No.
show, look, I firmly believe that you have undervalued or altered the valuation of some of these properties or that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and you would have thought that he would have made a song and dance about that, about doing that appeal process if that was
Yeah.
the concern.
Yeah. Well, and you would think that like they would have announced we have launched an appeal,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And this public facing campaign is part of a multifaceted effort because we genuinely believe that the city of Ottawa is being shortchanged in some way. Like, the city's budget is very tight. And this is also a mayor who really did not want to run on changing the revenue streams, right? In terms of increasing municipal property tax rates, or other things. I mean, I guess he's been into some more traffic fines and things like that, but I think it's probably pretty hard to fund a city on those.
Yeah, yeah, especially when your campaign promise was to hold property taxes at a level well below what we've had in inflation. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. All right. Speaking of city funding, we
Yeah.
also wanted to have a quick chat about some of the conditionality that the federal government has been putting on these new transit streams and whether that's actually an effective carrot and or stick.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So again, this did also come up in what the mayor said. He wants more money for operations, um, and he wants a better deal in terms of these cost shared projects.
Right.
The feds, in the most recent budget, re-announced permanent public transit funding. It's going to be $3 billion a year in perpetuity. That is going to be carved up into sort of two different buckets. Part of it is going to be allocation based. I can't quite remember the exact formula on that one. I think it's based on ridership, maybe. I'm not
I
totally
can't
sure.
remember offhand, but
Can't remember offhand.
yeah,
Um, so there's this one of like you get it based on an existing formula, right? It's only for capital projects and maintenance and so forth. It's not for operating, right? It's not to
yeah,
subsidize the actual day-to-day costs of running a transit system. And then the other one is projects based, which is all about sort of like funding new services, new expansion, that kind of thing. And there, the feds have, because housing,
yeah,
everything is about housing.
yes,
Um, the budget introduced these new conditions that basically said, and it's a little vague, right? But sort of, if you want our transit money, you have to give us things on the housing front that we want. Changes to things like zoning. There's a mention of sort of developer charges. There's a mention of issues around density. Here's a challenge.
particularly building around transit hubs and things like that.
Yeah, transit hubs, post-secondary education, as well.
Yeah,
Uh, so there's kind of a long list, right, actually, of conditions that are now being attached to transit money, that actually don't have necessarily much to do with transit, but these guys have decided leverage, leverage, leverage. Okay,
yeah.
that's fine. Now, here's a challenge. Define a post-secondary education institute. Like I work at Carleton. I know that that's one, but what
Yeah.
about Herzing Career College, locations?
Okay.
Do, do the same rules apply there? But we're still waiting on details to be determined. Um, Major transit hub. Okay. So if you have sort of a space where more than 10 bus routes all converge, is that a major hub? I don't know, right? Like,
Yeah.
so I think there's a lot of these issues around the conditionality that, even setting aside the, will this actually be an incentive for cities? There's just issues of, once you put that as a program parameter, you've got to define it and you've got to make it really clear. And so I think that's going to be a real challenge, for them on that. Like, these programs aren't yet open, as far as I can tell, for applications yet. So there's no
Right.
information yet online of how these are all going to be defined. But then there's the issue of, if a city did the math and they looked at it and they said, gosh, we get more in developer charges than we would possibly get under this allocation program, or what we might hope to get under a cost shared one third, one third, one third, project based funding. What if they say no?
Yeah. And I've heard stories of cities already starting to do that.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
guess they're
There
starting to
was
do the
one or
math.
two where they decided to increase the development charges, and someone said, doesn't this mean you're going to lose this bucket of federal money? And they said, we're going to make more in these charges than we would from that federal bucket. So we're going to go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, and no, look,
I don't
a
remember
lot
what
of
city
these.
it was, but I did read this. So
Okay, okay.
yeah.
Now, a lot of these trade-offs, of course, they're going to depend on. It's going to depend municipality to municipality, and it's going to depend in part around like what are their actual transit needs. Like, do they want to go for the project-based funding,
Yeah.
right? Or not. And even there, it's going to be a little tricky in some circumstances. Like, think about the Metro Vancouver, the Greater Vancouver area. You've got a bunch of different municipalities who are each in charge of various aspects of of housing policy. Some of it is, kind of been pulled up to the provincial level.
Right.
Um, but out there, you have this sort of like super transit authority that
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
these cities. So who are you doing the deal with, right? And how are they going to then enforce? Like the feds have to do a deal with the transit authority. How are they going to then enforce getting all of the cities to make these policy changes?
Yeah, that's actually something I hadn't thought of. Huh. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah.
Last time I checked, for example, transit authorities are not particularly, I mean, like they can advocate and they make presentations and all the rest of it, but they don't really have a coercive power over local governments at the end of the day,
Yeah.
right? They can't really make them do what they want them to do. So
Certainly not.
no, no. Anyway, yeah, all this to say, interesting times ahead in terms of federal, provincial, municipal fiscal arrangements. Because even if there's a change of government next year, Pierre Poliver has proposed a very similar sort of policy direction, very
Yeah.
similar.
Yeah, and for viewers, if you read Paul Well's Substack, he did a post on this last week where he did the math and found that the incentive payments that Polyev was making or was proposing for certain of these cities, which couldn't actually work because of the way the agreements are structured, and Jennifer had a great piece on that as well. That some of these payments were like 1% of a city's budget. Um, so it doesn't really make it all that worthwhile for them to jump through a bunch of hoops for a lot of things that they have little control over as well. So
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to see how we've been hearing so much about the federal government needs to use their leverage to get to incentivize building, but just how little leverage that actually winds up being in the end. I think that's a really interesting thing that we should probably pay a little more attention to.
Well, again, it's sort of like, if you want to call the shots, you got to put in a serious, serious amount of money that is really hard for another jurisdiction to resist.
Yeah.
And then you also like you got to be conscientious of staying in your lane, right? Like
Yeah.
you can't be using your federal spending power to make policy in another jurisdiction. So yeah, this is anyway, all this to say, it feels like we're into sort of a new period in terms of these intergovernmental relations and disputes, and I expect to see a lot more of these sort of whingy public statements and so forth from various orders of government about fairness and unfairness, and
Oh yeah.
yeah,
A lot of talk about fairness.
yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to do this. It's always great to talk to you, and we'll do this
Likewise.
in the near future.
All right, thanks again.
All right. Cheers.
Bye.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter and journodale_no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.